I saw that under the sun, the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to men of skill. But time and chance happen to them all. Ecclesiastes 9:11. Usually on History She Wrote episodes, we take an event in the present and relate it to another event in the past. If a belief in cyclical history is your thing, reminders of the limited scripts humans follow, albeit with seemingly unlimited budget for setting, is a helpful tool in dealing with current events. But because human nature is to write, read, and watch what we know, those limited scripts make their way into fiction as well. And because fiction can be so much less messy than the tangle of true human events, it's a supremely useful tool in illustrating some of the more uncomfortable moments of the past. Although the trend is changing, in fiction, good and evil can be one dimensional. That makes it much easier for people to side with the good and openly point out and hate the bad. Fiction tends to be much more clear than real life and real history. And so, in this episode of History She Wrote, we're going to look at historical truths through the lens of fiction. The single biggest issue with history and fiction alike is unintended consequences. We'll look at this using one of my favorite rainy day comfort shows, Stranger Things. Unintended consequences are present in every single decision we make, big or small, every single time. For many decisions, the implications are so small as to seem meaningless, but that doesn't mean they stay that way. And in the vast majority of cases, unintended consequences strike in ways that absolutely cannot be anticipated. In season 2 of Stranger Things, my personal favorite character, Murray, helps Nancy and Jonathan create and send a reasonable scenario that results in the Hopkins lab, which had opened a portal to an evil place called the Upside Down, get shut down via pressure from news exposés. In fact, Murray, again, my favorite character, sits in a lawn chair outside the gate of the lab and laughs uproariously and triumphantly and waves as the vehicles depart. He's gleeful, and he should be. What the lab was doing was evil. But what came next, enabled by Nancy, Jonathan, and Murray, all doing the right thing for the right reasons, was even worse. As science fiction meets the plot of The Americans, the Soviets managed to sneak an entire base under Hawkins and resume the evil dimension exploration that the Hawkins lab began. Only now, there was no oversight, and no one knew what was going on until the noisy group of gamer kids became suspicious and got involved. Unintended consequences. By shutting down Hawkins' lab, the Soviets were able to sneak in and make the whole situation even worse. But do we have any actual historic examples of unintended consequences as severe as reopening portals to hell? Why, yes, and thank you for asking. The Constitutio Criminalis Carolina came into effect in 1532 in the Holy Roman Empire. It was the first unified code of criminal law in these areas and was sorely needed at a time when the population was at the mercy of wandering mercenary soldiers. The government desperately needed people to trust in the justice of the government in order to make a safer empire. And the Carolina established the procedures and bureaucracy to ensure this, including ushering in the golden heyday of the state executioner. But it also ushered in the witch persecutions and the burnings, which still loom large in Western thought. How could this happen? Well, in order to align the understanding of state justice in the minds of the population, a particularly brutal, absolutely brutal period of punishment needed to take place. People needed to trust that the government would administer justice. And the best way to gain that trust was many public examples of the government dealing with thieves, murderers, arsonists, and witches. The Carolina prescribed burning as a sentence for witches. Society truly believed in witchcraft as an all-encompassing evil at that time, and the methods to extract confessions, as well as demands for proof, were not up to the standards portrayed on Law and Order. But we would not have the criminal codes we have in the West today without the Carolina, witch burnings or not. When the Carolina was written, no one intended it to be used for the mass torture and murder of women who had the gall to be successful, or who just generally irritated men in power. Humans may have limited scripts to follow, but their ingenuity in twisting loopholes in a situation to their advantage has no peer and no natural brake pedal. See the ever increasingly complex and draconian tax rules for a constantly evolving example. People will find loopholes, always. My personal favorite movie example of a loophole, and one of my favorite movies in general, is portrayed brilliantly by Jason Bateman in Bad Words. Bateman's character, Guy Trilby, dropped out of middle school as a kid. He also had a need for revenge against the man who had abandoned his mother. When this deadbeat father, with a talent for words, founded a spelling bee, the rule that a participant must not have graduated the 8th grade made perfect sense. After all, in this day and age, everyone graduates middle school, whether they should or not. Everyone except Guy Trilby. And from there, hijinks abound. Then, of course, we have the whole Lord of the Rings, How to Kill the Lord of the Nazgul loophole, exploited ever so neatly by Eowyn, and much more poetically than Shakespeare's version, at the risk of being a literary heretic. But have these loopholes ever changed history? Oh, yes, in many, many ways. Now, the original meaning of loophole refers to those arrow slits and fortification walls where archers could aim and fire with some sort of protection from the enemy. It took something near 100 years to acquire the meaning that we use today, a way to wriggle out of following a rule. An amusing historic example of a loophole would rest with the poet Lord Byron, who was quite ticked off, as anyone would be, to discover he could not bring his pet dog to Trinity College. The rule, however, said nothing about pet bears. Having purchased a bear at a fair, when asked what was to be done with the bear, he answered, "He should sit for a fellowship." Very cheeky. Far less amusing was the case of the Spartan general Pausanias in the 5th century BCE. Pausanias had a lot to live up to as a nephew of the great Leonidas who fell at the Battle of Thermopylae. And it seemed that he was living up to his family name. He served as a regent for Leonidas' son, and he was winning major battles for the Spartans. Even Herodotus waxed poetic about Pausanias, saying he won the most glorious victory of any known to us. But then another war loomed with the Persian Empire. Pausanias, it seemed, may have conspired with the Persians, and he didn't hide it very well. Under threat of death, he ran into a temple of Athena, knowing he could not be tried or put to death while inside. And he wasn't. Instead, the Spartans exploited a loophole in that rule. They couldn't go in the temple and kill him, but nothing said they could not simply brick him inside the temple until he starved to death. Which is what they did, with Pausanias' mother laying the first brick. Spartan mothers being somewhat less sentimental than mothers of the modern day. Of course, the Spartans weren't the only culture to figure out how to kill someone while still following the rules of not actually killing someone. The Ottomans had a rule against shedding blood of their royal family, but they also had a tradition of fratricide upon attending the throne. It was fairly easy to reconcile these two issues. The brothers of new sultans were strangled to death with a silken cord. In the case of Mehmed III, including a brother still in his infancy. And thousands of years of human history later, we can't be lulled into thinking we've managed to close most loopholes either. Loopholes are rather like the fabled Hydra. Close one and two more open in its place. Generally as a result of unintended consequences. All of this seems to result in problems stemming from the choices people make. And that would be absolutely true. It's enough to put a person off making choices entirely, a technique practiced by bureaucrats the world over, who shelve decisions indefinitely rather than risk making the wrong choice. After all, you're far more likely to get in trouble for doing something than for not doing anything, right? And that's precisely what we see in the movie and historic Death of Stalin, when the Soviet leader didn't wake up in time one morning. Now, the movie, The Death of Stalin, it's not a documentary. And there are numerous lists online which detail any historical inaccuracies in the film. Side note, I think this is a fantastic practice and should be done with all TV and films based in history. But moving on, first and foremost, there really couldn't have been anything done to save Stalin, even if he had been found earlier. Although perhaps some of his dignity could have been preserved with less urine soaking his pajamas in the carpet. In any case, it was nearly 10:30 the next night before the Soviet dictator was discovered. And even upon discovery, the household staff were unsure what to do. And further prevaricating took place until someone finally called Beria. And even then, Beria did not take immediate action on behalf of the man who had killed more Soviet citizens than the Nazis. It took until 7 the next morning for the Ministry of Health to be contacted and the search for a doctor to begin. Even then, in line with unintended consequences, Stalin's horrific purge of doctors meant there weren't many left. In fact, one medical professional was mid-torture investigation when the question suddenly shifted from his involvement in plots against the Soviet state to medical information on how to treat someone who had suffered a stroke. There may be historic details wrong in the movie version of The Death of Stalin, but the absurdity was on the nose. Especially if, as some theorize, Stalin's death was more planned and less surprise. It's probably the perfect ending to this episode of History She Wrote, using the point where cinema and historical reality meet. Truthfully, there are unending examples of unintended consequences, loopholes, and indecision in the major and minor incidents of world history. Some of which are so outlandish that they're difficult to believe. And yet, they happened. This is merely the quickest mention of a few of these events, and I hope you'll use this episode as a jumping off point to learn more about the history we've discussed, and unintended consequences of literally everything. We like to use a quote attributed to Mark Twain as an overarching theme for our history projects. History may not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Perhaps, though, in this case, we should add in a paraphrased quote along the same lines by Karl Marx. History repeats itself, first as a tragedy, and second as a farce.